Welcome to the Kent Lapp Podcast.
A clinical psychologist was actually on a business call that I was on, and one of the things she shared was that in situations like this, people tend to want to be plugged in to the news cycle because they feel like the more information they get, the less anxiety they'll have.
Mm-hmm.
But in times of crisis, what you actually tend to observe is the opposite: is that the more data you get, the more anxious you become, and the less in control you feel. And so I took her advice, and I definitely think it's helped curb some of that anxiety. But in terms of the stats I have been watching, it was Friday or Saturday. I actually went back and looked to see what the CDC had to say about 2019 mortality rates associated with the flu. And it's a range because of mistakes in either how it's tracked or people that had other comorbidities like maybe age or maybe they had cancer when the flu, but at the high end of the range, mortalities in the U.S. related to the flu last year were around 60,000 people. And I think
in 2019, not necessarily the flu season, but in 2019.
Right, the calendar year, January
60,000 deaths.
And so I think that is when my position has really started to take a very dramatic change from let's all hunker down, let's do what we need to do, towards kind of where I started at the beginning of this discussion of we've got to start getting answers one way or the other. And the reason that statistic caused that change was largely because just recently the CDC modified their estimation of mortalities related to COVID this year to be at around 60,000 by September.
Really?
Which, for me, I'm looking at it going, well, now wait a minute, because so far we've all been justifying this with the belief that this was however many times more deadly than the flu.
Right.
And if we believe that that's true, certainly the quarantining and social distancing will reduce those figures. However, we should also see reduced figures in 2020 for the flu and other common viruses that are seasonal as well, because quarantine should be effective not just towards COVID, but all seasonal viruses.
Right. Yeah, quarantine does not have a special relationship with COVID-19.
Exactly.
It's going to help with flus and everything else.
Right. So I think for me, if all we know about the virus is its R rating, which is how infectious a virus is, and we do know from laboratory testing that it's very high.
Very infectious.
Right. Yep. Very easily caught, very easily transmitted. There was actually a study that found that it can travel on pollution in the air over very great distances now. So
really? Like more than what? More than like a few feet?
Yeah. Yeah. I can't remember the exact article. I read it 2 nights ago. I'm going to say, whatever institution I say, I think would be a lie because I don't remember exactly what it was. But I remember it coming from what appeared to be a reputable study showing that basically any type of particulate matter in the air can actually carry COVID. So it can travel miles via the air.
Miles?
Miles.
Holy cow.
Yeah. So
wow.
To me, it just seems inevitable that we're all going to get it.
Yeah.
And certainly we should try to protect people that are especially susceptible, like my father-in-law, like my mother. But I think we need data that's meaningful, and that's what we don't have.
What would going back to work do for testing and data?
Well, I think, if you want to use a blunt object here to treat everything as a nail, for me, I think the logical output would be, if it's really as deadly and severe as we've been told that it is, and it certainly looks that way in some other first world countries, then if everyone started returning to work, we should actually see our hospitals get overrun pretty quickly.
Right.
But, you look at Davidson County here in Nashville, where we are, we've had, whatever it is, 2,500 total cases so far.
In the county?
Mm-hmm.
In Davidson County?
Yeah.
Okay.
And in Davidson County, we have 4,500 hospital beds. And in my church's small group, we have a young woman who is a nurse, and she said when the first thing got started, had all been put on alert, that they were told to expect crazy hours, intense work conditions. And, I think the story that she told us is also very common for most other major municipalities in the U.S., which is that they never really saw that wave.
Right.
So either social distancing and quarantining has worked, or, when I drove here for the interview today and I see tons of cars on the road, even though quarantine's still in effect.
Right.
It's difficult for me to discern. Did quarantine work, or is this thing not as deadly as we think?
Well, that's the question. That's what I've always wondered when it comes to the flu is, okay, you said 60,000 deaths in 2019 related to the flu, but everyone's going about their normal lives. Everything's good. There's people in bars, bumping elbows, hugging the whole nine. People are doing business. You're just going about your normal American life, which, let's be honest, your normal American life is not healthy at all.
Sure.
Your normal American life is you're eating food on the fly. You're eating way too much fast food. You're not exercising. You're working. It's a stressful sort of environment. Everyone's chasing the dream. You know what I mean? You're either chasing the dream and putting your body at sacrifice, or you're just like, just hanging out, drinking a bunch of beer and smoking cigarettes. You know what I mean? Like there's a lot of extremes here in this American culture that we have. It's not healthy at all.
Sure.
And of course, there's lots of people that are super, super healthy and actually care a little bit about their health. But for the most part, people are just doing their thing. And there's not a lot of attention paid to what they're eating or what they're doing or the exercise or, how their body is immune to certain things. Like there's just not much attention paid to that.
Sure.
So that's what I've always been curious is if we just kept that going, then what would have happened? Which in a sense, we're going to get data and we're going to be able to probably project like, at some point, don't you think, we'll be able to look back and run some scenarios on if we hadn't quarantined, if we hadn't shut down the entire economy, this is potentially how it would have played out, right? Once we get to know this thing. Right now, we still don't know it very well.
Sure.
But that's I've always been curious about is if we didn't close down the entire economy, how bad would it be?
Yeah, to me, it seems like a more faithful approach that was more honest about how poor the data is that we have might have been to take an upper limit approach rather than trying to flatten the curve. And what I mean by that is, governmental decision makers, especially in local municipalities at the city level, would have a direct line of visibility to how many cases were coming into their local hospitals.
Mm-hmm.
So why not, as opposed to let's everyone put, everyone's financial futures and ability to provide for their families at total risk on the front end, why don't we let this play out for a couple of weeks and see what happens?
Mm-hmm.
And if we really are seeing even predictive, I'd be okay not waiting until everything was overrun, but let's actually let it look like that's where we're headed first, right? I mean, accurate regressions or predictions at this point based on trend data are pretty basic stats at this point that anyone with Excel can run pretty accurately at this point in history. So I think for me, it seems like a more dutiful approach would have been, let's wait a minute and see what happens. And maybe the spike never happens.
Right.
Or maybe we learn a lot and we realize, oh, okay, no, this really is bad. So let's start being dramatic. Let's start cutting back and get this thing under control.
Yep.
That isn't the approach we've taken, and I think in my mind it points to one of two realities. Either one, at the highest levels of government around the world, every first world country in the world is completely inept, and they have no control over their societies, no ability to actually force people to truly lock down and quarantine like they did when polio was going around. Or, and this is where I'm leaning, at the highest levels where you would believe to have the best data, they know that this isn't actually as life-threatening as all the news media circus would have us believe it is. And that's why we haven't seen any first world government outside of maybe some communist nations really dramatically shut down the entire country in an extreme way. Italy and maybe some parts of Western Europe aside, which I think there were some bizarre things happening there too, it just seems like if this was really as deadly as we're being led to believe that it is, that something like martial law would have happened.